Boy, I'll tell you, it is raining out there today. I can think of only two places I want to be on a day like this. I either want to be in the shop building furniture, or I want to be browsing around in an antique store like this. Now, I've been here before, and there's a lot of interesting pieces to see, and the prices are pretty good. Look at this chest, this blanket chest. Looks quite similar to the one we built. And over here, a nice pine hope chest. Very thick pine boards. Let's see, $495. Not bad for a piece in this condition. Look at these chairs, all hand painted. You know, this is a project that I hope to be able to build someday. But over here, this is what I wanted you to see. A punch tin front pie safe. Now, it comes from the Midwest, and it dates to about 1875. The most interesting story, though, is about this little Dutchman. They said it was a rat hole. Must have been something awful good to eat in that drawer. Now, inside, it's nice and deep, couple shelves, and whoever punched this tin sure likes stars. One in each corner, a little tiny one in the middle, and a large one surrounded by a circle. There's some good ideas here. I better take some notes. I'd also like to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Let's get started on today's project. Well, what do you think of our version of the old-fashioned pie safe? A couple small drawers at the top, two doors that open up into a relatively deep storage compartment with adjustable shelves, and a full-width drawer across the bottom that can be pretty useful. Now, most of the pie safes that we looked at, all the joinery between rails and stiles was assembled with mortise and tenons. A perfectly acceptable joint, but time-consuming to make. And today we have some options. One of those options is biscuit joinery. You've seen me use it an awful lot. Now, these beechwood biscuits at each joint, combined with our modern glues, make a joint that's just as strong as the mortise and tenon and easier and quicker to make. Now, these tin panels, they were a lot of fun once I found the tin. And I'll show you how I made those a little bit later. What I want to do is get started making the sides of the cabinet. There's a frame which has two stiles and three rails, and fitted into that frame are some solid wood panels. And the bottom of the stiles have a little taper, mostly for looks. So over here on the workbench, I've laid out the parts for one side of the cabinet. Now, one of the things I like about biscuit joinery is that my rails get cut to their finished length. I don't have to allow for the tenons, which sometimes can get you in trouble. Now, the first thing I want to do is put a groove in all the frame parts to receive the solid wood panel. Now, the groove is held a little bit closer to the finished side of the panel, and that's so that these wooden panels won't stick inside the cabinet. Now, I'll make the groove over on my router table. Now, the grooves that I have to make in the stiles run from rail to rail, plus about a ½ inch. And that's because I don't want to put a groove where my biscuit is going to be located later. Now, to make that groove, I need to do what's known as a plunge cut, or plunge the piece over the router bit. So I've installed a piece of tape and put a pencil mark a ½ inch on each side of the bit. And by lining up my layout line for the rail, I can place it in the right position. Now that all the grooves are made for the panels, the next thing to do is make the slots for the biscuits in the rails and stiles. This is a tool that I'm going to use. It has a little saw blade in it that plunges out as you move the whole motor assembly. And it also has a fine adjustment on this side for the different sizes of biscuits that are used. I'm going to start with a 20. And that's all there is to it. Okay, now for the narrow rails, I'm going to have to switch to the smallest biscuit cut, which is 0. Now here are the 4 pieces of pine for my panels. They're 1/2 inch thick, and they've already been cut to size. But in order for the panel to fit into the grooves of the stiles and rails, I need to make a little rabbet joint like that. So it'll just slip in there. Now to make that rabbet, I'm using my stacked dado head cutter. I've also installed this wooden auxiliary fence to protect my dado head cutter from the metal rip fence. And it's set up to make a 3/8 inch wide by 1/4 inch deep rabbet. The stiles on the side panel have a slight taper, as I showed you before, and that's mostly for looks. I'll do that over here. I've clamped the piece in the workbench. I'm going to use a handsaw to make the cut. I'm going to leave the line because I'm going to smooth it up with my block plane. Okay, now to smooth up the roughness of the cut, a couple passes with the block plane. Well, now we're ready for some assembly. And the first thing to do is roll a little glue at each location where the rail is going to meet the stile. Now I'll just put a little bit of glue in each biscuit slot and work it in with a brush. Now a little glue on the biscuits, and I'll just set them in the slots, moving as quickly as possible so the glue doesn't set up. Now the biscuits for the middle rails, even though I'm using the smallest one that's available, I had to nip off a little bit on each end so that it wouldn't be too long. Now I'm going to spread some glue on the ends of each rail piece and put some in the biscuit slot just like before. Now before the glue sets up, I might as well put this rail in position. Now I'll just slip the panels in. No glue here, they're just going to float. Okay, and now I'm just going to slip the other stile into position. Okay, now I'm just going to put a clamp at each joint and set it aside and make the other side panel. Let's take a look at the prototype. I want to show you how those side panels are joined together. There's actually 3 frames. One frame is up here, and what that does is it's used to fasten the top, and it keeps the drawers from tipping out as they're removed. There's another frame right here on which the small drawers ride, and there's another frame way down at the bottom on which the large drawer rides. Now they're put together just like the side panels with biscuits and glue. Okay, that's the last of the frames. Put a little clamp pressure on this one. We'll get to work on the doors. Okay, now before I put the last clamp on, I want to check this door for square, and that's simply done by taking diagonal measurements. And if they're both equal, then the door is square. Well, that's as close as I'm going to get. Now you would think that finding the tin for these panels would be an easy job. At least that's what I thought. I made a phone call to the first listing under tin, and I really ended up getting nowhere. After several phone calls, I finally found a metal crafting shop that would either sell me panels that were already punched or the raw materials like this to punch my own. And this is a piece of sheet tin. It's even got a little bit of rust on it, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It actually adds a lot of character to the piece. Now, the first thing that I wanted to do was find out about punching the tin, so I read different articles, and here's what I've come up with. First, I want to cut the piece to size. And ordinarily, you would cut the tin with a pair of tin snips. But I found that tin snips are difficult when you do long, straight cuts. You either have to buy a very expensive pair of straight cutting snips, or you end up curling the metal as you cut it. So I found a much easier method, and that's just to use a framing square and a good sharp utility knife. Now, the height of my panel is 10 3/4, so I'm going to set my square to 10 3/4, and then just score the metal 6 or 7 times. Just shears off. Well, now for the design of the tin punching. I discovered that most of the panels on the pie safes were inspired by quilt patterns or butter molds. This one was inspired by a quilt pattern, but I guess you could call it an Abram original. I sat down at my drafting board and sketched out a perimeter and a pineapple in the middle. Then I took a felt tip pen and put a dot every place I wanted a punch mark. Now, because you can only use the patterns once, I made several photocopies for all the panels. Over here, I've set up a station to punch the tin. I made the patterns a little bit longer so that I could fold them over the edges of the blank tin. That way it would be held in place a little bit better. Now I'm setting it on a piece of particle board. You could use masonite, or you could even use plywood as long as it didn't have any voids in it, because if there's a void, the punch will go in too deeply. I'm just going to use some screws to hold these angles down. You could also use a piece of wood if you want. Okay, now the tool for punching the tin couldn't be simpler. It's just a scratch-awl to make sure it's kept good and sharp. It's also a good idea to have a piece of scrap tin around so you can practice. What you'll find is, depending on how hard you strike the awl, will determine the diameter of the hole. I'm looking for about 1/16 of an inch. Now, it's a lot of fun, but it takes some time and some patience. There are 450 punches on this panel, so I'd better get started. Where I know when I made the first panel, when I unscrewed it like this and it curled up, I was terrified. It looks okay. But what I discovered is that if I just gently roll it back into shape, that I can get it to sit flat. Well, 5 more to go. While I was punching those tin panels, the glue had ample time to dry, so now I can get back to work on the wood. And the first thing I want to do is scrape any excess glue from each joint and then sand them smooth. Let's take a look at the prototype. Each of the side panels have 2 cross dados, one for the top frame and one for the frame that supports the bottom drawer. Now, I've set up my table saw with a stacked dado head cutter for 3/4 of an inch width and about 1/4 of an inch depth. And I've adjusted the rip fence to make the dado along the top of the panel first. Now I'm just going to readjust my rip fence to make the dado for the bottom draw support. I want to set it at 5 inches. Okay. Now on the back of the pie safe, I've recessed the plywood. And to do that, I needed to make a rabbet in the side panels. So I've set up the table saw to run those. I've installed two cleats, one up at the top here to support the small drawer runners, and one down at the bottom to support the fixed shelves, just with glue and nails. Next, I want to work on this cross frame, the frame that supports the small drawers. And I've installed side guides and now a backstop, held in place with glue and nails. Here on the frame for the lower drawer, the process is the same, side guides and a backstop. Now there's one little thing I have to do to the bottom shelf, and if I tip it back, I can show you that underneath there are a couple cleats, and they'll prevent the drawer from tipping out as it's opened. I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to put these in now than after the case is already assembled. Okay, now let's assemble it. First, the small drawer support frame, held in place with some glue and screws. Now I'll install the top frame. And now for the bottom shelf. And the last element, the bottom drawer frame. And after that's in, I'll install the other side the same way. Now before I put the back on, a little glue across the shelves and in the rabbet. Well, now it's time to start installing the face frame. But before I can do that, I have to notch the drawer support frames. All right, now we're ready to install the face frame. First, the stiles. I want you to take note that I've made some slots for the biscuits where the rails are going to meet, and I've also taken the time to mortise out for the hinges. It's a lot easier to do it now before it's installed. So with the glue in place, I'm just going to set the stile down and nail it with some 4-penny finish nails. You might have noticed that on this plywood shelf I edge banded it with pine, and that's so the laminations won't show through. I've put a little glue along the bottom edge, and I've glued the biscuit in place. I'm going to slip this rail on, holding it down from the top of the shelf about 1/4 inch. That way it'll act as a stop when the doors are closed. All right. Now up at the top part of the face frame, there's a couple more pieces. One is this center stile. It's a divider between the drawers. And now the top rail. And finally, the last piece of the face frame, the other stile. Using this setup of a template, with my router and a guide collar, I've made all the mortises for the hinges. Of course, you could do the same job with a sharp chisel and a hammer. This rabbet that I'm making on the inside of the door frames is to receive the tin panel. And I'm making it using a 3/8 inch rabbiting bit in my router. Well, the router is great, but you still need a chisel to square up the corners. Okay, that takes care of hanging the doors. I don't want to put the tin in yet, not until after the finish has been applied. Now we'll attach the top. The top is made from 3½ pieces of 1x6, which I glued and biscuited together. I've cut it to size and sanded it smooth. Now it hangs over the side and front of the case by about 1 3/8 inches. And I'll fasten it with some 2-inch screws, but because I'm in such tight quarters, I'm going to have to drive these by hand with a little stubby screwdriver. I think this pine scotia does a nice job dressing up the top edge. All the drawers are made the same. The side pieces have a dado along the bottom edge for the plywood bottom, a dado along the back for the back of the drawer, and a couple biscuits at the front to reinforce that joint. Now the front piece also has a groove for the plywood bottom and slots for the biscuits. I'm just using the clamps to pull the joint tight until it's nailed. Don't use any glue, screws only to hold the front to the drawer box. Now the tin and the hardware will go on later, after we put on the finish. We always get a little nervous when we start staining pine, and it's because of the grain of pine, and you put stain on it, it tends to get blotchy and doesn't look very good. But I found that with this water-soluble stain, if I put it on with a brush first, almost like paint, lay it on kind of heavy, and then let it set for a while and wipe it with a rag that's been dampened in some stain. It works pretty well. I'll show you up on the top where it's already set. Just take the rag and dip it in some stain so that it's damp, and then work the panel. And you can see now I kind of even it out, and it looks pretty good. Okay, I'd say that that's just about the look I want. Now I'm going to let this stain dry for a few hours. Then I'll protect the entire piece with 2 coats of satin finish polyurethane. And then after that dries, I'll reinstall the tin panels, and this piece will be ready for the pies or whatever else you'd like to store in it. Okay, now that's what our pie safe looks like with the final coat of urethane and the tin panels installed. In fact, the tin is starting to show some signs of rust, which is really the look that we want. It's a very useful piece.